Chapter 1 of Stalky Co. More Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Stalky Co. More Stories by Rudyard Kipling. Chapter 1. Stalky. How they have taken Kinmont Willie against the peace of the border tide, and they forgot that the bold Buccleuch was keeper here on the Scottish side. Kinmont Willie. And then Davitry said they were beastly funks not to help, and I said they were too many chaps in it to suit us. Besides, there's bound to be a mess somewhere or other, with old Davitry in charge. Wasn't I right? Quite. And anyhow, it's a silly business I bung through. What'll they do with the beastly cows when they've got 'em? You can milk a cow if she'll stand still. That's all right. You're a pig, Beetle. No, I ain't. But what's the sense of driving a lot of cows up from the burrows to where is it? They're trying to drive them to Toohey's barnyard at the top of the hill, the empty one, where we smoked last Tuesday. It's a revenge. Vidley chivied Davitry twice last week for riding his ponies on the burrows, and Davitry is going to lift as many of old Vidley's cattle as he can and plant 'em up the hill. He'll muck it, though, with Parsons, Orrin, and Howlett helping. They'll only yell and shout and bunk if they see Vidley. We might have managed it, said McTurk slowly, turning up his coat collar against the rain that swept over the burrows. His hair was of the dark mahogany red that goes with a certain temperament. We should, Corcoran replied with equal confidence, but they've gone into it as if it was a sort of spridger hunt. I've never done any cattle lifting, but it seems to me that one might just as well be stalky about a thing as not. Smoking vapours of the Atlantic drove low in pearly grey wreaths above the boys' heads. Out of the mist to windward, beyond the grey loom of the Pebble Ridge, came an unceasing roar of the sea, rising and falling in mile-long rollers. To leeward, a few stray ponies and cattle, the property of northern pot-wallopers, and the playthings of the boys in their leisure hours, showed through the haze. Beyond, blotted out, lay Appledore and the flats of her pool, where the Tor and the Torridge join. They halted by the cattle gate, which marks the limit of cultivation, where Northam Hill comes down to the burrows. Beetle, shock-haired and bespectacled, drew his nose pensively to and fro along the wet top bar. McTurk shifted from one foot to the other, watching the water drain into either print, while Corcoran whistled through his teeth as he leaned against the sod bank, peering into the mist. A grown or sane person might have called the weather vile, but the boys of the college had not yet learned the national interest in climate. It was a little damp, to be sure, but it was always damp in Easter term, and, this was an article of faith, sea wet could not give one a cold under any circumstances. Mackintoshes were excellent things to go to church in, but crippling if one had to run at short notice across heavy country. So they waited serenely in the downpour, clad as their mothers would not have cared to see. "I say," said Beetle, wiping his spectacles for the 20th time, "if we weren't going to help Davitry, what are we here for?" "We're going to watch, of course. I wish to goodness they'd hurry up." "It's an awful biznai driving cattle in the open country," said McTurk, who, as the son of an Irish baronet, knew something of these operations. "They'll have to run off over the burrows after 'em. Suppose they're riding Vidley's ponies?" "Davitry's sure to be. He's a dab on a horse. Listen, what a filthy row they're making. They'll be heard for miles." The thick air filled with whoops and shouts, cries, words of command, the rattle of broken golf clubs, and the clatter of hoofs. 3 cows, with their calves, came up to the cattle gate at an indignant milch canter, followed by 4 heifers and some bullocks. A fat and freckled youth of 15 trotted behind them, riding barebacked and brandishing a hedge stake. De Vitre, up to a certain point, was an inventive youth, with a passion for horse exercise that the northern commoners did not encourage. Farmer Vidley had once called him a thief, for the small matter of chasing cows across the burrows, and the insult rankled. Hence the raid. "Come on," he cried over his shoulder. "Open the gate, Corcoran, or they'll all cut back again. We've had no end of bother to get 'em. Oh, won't old Vidley be wild?" 3 boys on foot ran up, shooing the cattle in excited amateur fashion, till they headed into the narrow, high-banked Devonshire lane that led up the hill. "Come on, Corcoran, it's no end of a lark," pleaded de Vitre, but Corcoran shook his head. The raid had been presented to him after dinner that day as a completed scheme in which he might, by favour, play a minor part, and Arthur Lane Corcoran, number 104, did not care for lieutenancies. "You'll be collared," he cried, as he shut the gate. "Parsons and Orrin are no good in a row. You'll be collared for sure as a gun, de Vitre." "Oh, you're a beastly funk." The speaker was already hidden by the mist. "Hang it all," said McTurk. "It's about the first time we've ever had a cattle lift at the Col. Let's—" "Not much. Keep your eye on Uncle," said Corcoran firmly. His word was law in matters like these. Experience had taught them that if they manoeuvred without Corcoran, they fell into trouble. "You're jealous because you didn't think of it first," said Beetle, and Corcoran kicked him 3 times, slowly, neither he nor Beetle changing a muscle the while. "No, I ain't. But it isn't stalky enough for me." Stalky, in the school vocabulary, meant clever, well considered, and wily. As applied to a plan of action, and stalkiness was the one virtue Corcoran toiled after. "Same thing," said McTurk. "You think you're the only stalky chap in the Col." Corcoran kicked him as he had kicked Beetle, and, even as Beetle, McTurk took not the faintest notice. By the etiquette of their 3-year-old friendship, this was no more than formal notice of dissent from a proposition. "They haven't thrown out any pickets." Not for nothing did the school prepare boys for Sandhurst. They ought to do that, even for apples. Tooheys barnyard may be full of people for all they know. "'Twasn't last week," said Beetle, "when we smoked in that cart-shed place. It's a mile from the house, too." Up went one of Corcoran's light eyebrows. "Oh, Beetle, I am so tired of kicking you. Does that mean it's empty now? They ought to have sent one fellow ahead to look. They're simply bound to be collared. And where'll they bunk to, if they have to run for it? Parsons has only been here 2 terms. He don't know the lie of the country. Orrin's a fat ass, and Howlett bunks from a governor." Vernacular for a native of Devon engaged in agricultural pursuits. "As far as he can see one. De Vitre's the only decent chap in the lot, and I put him up to try and Tooheys farmyard." "Well, keep your hair on," said Beetle. "What are we going to do? It's rather damp here." "Let's think a bit." Corcoran whistled between his teeth, and presently broke into a swift, short double shuffle. "We'll go straight up and see what happens to 'em. Cut across the fields and lie up in the hedge where the lane comes in by the barn, where we found the dead hedgehog last term. Come on." He scrambled over the earth bank and dropped into the rain-soaked plough. It was a stiff rise to the brow of the hill where Tooheys outbarn stood. The boys took no account of stiles or footpaths, crossing field after field diagonally, and where they found a hedge, bursting through it like beagles. The lane lay on their right flank, and they heard much lowing and shouting from that direction. "Well, If he isn't collared, said McTurk, kicking off a few pounds of loam against the gate-post, he jolly well ought to be. We'll be collared too if you go with your nose up like that. Duck, you ass, and come along under the hedge. We can get quite close up to the barn, said Corcoran. There's no sense in not doing a thing stalkerly while you're about it. They wriggled into the top of an old hollow double hedge, less than 30 yards from the big black timbered barn and the square outbuildings. Their 10 minutes uphill climb had lifted them a couple of 100 feet above the burrows. As the mists parted here and there, they could see the great triangle of sodden green, tipped with yellow sand dunes and fringed with half a mile of white foam, laid out like a blurred map below. The steady thunder of the surge along the pebble ridge made the background to the wild noises in the lane. "What did I tell you?" said Corcoran, peering through the dripping stems of quickset which commanded a view of the farmyard. 3 farm chaps getting out dung with pitchforks. It's too late to head off to Vitre. We'd be collared if we showed up. Besides, they've heard 'em. They couldn't help hearing. What asses!" The natives, brandishing their weapons, talked together, using many times the word collager. As the tumult swelled, they disappeared into various pens and byres. The first of the cattle trotted up to the yard gate, and de Vitre felicitated his band. "That's all right," he shouted. "Oh, won't old Vidley be wild? Open the gate! Open the gate, Orrin, and whack 'em through. They're pretty warm." "So will you be in a minute," muttered McTurk. The raiders hurried into the yard behind the cattle. They heard a shout of triumph, shrill yells of despair, saw one Devonian guarding the gate with a pitchfork, while the others, alas, captured all 4 boys. "Of all the infernal, idiotic, lower-second asses," said Corcoran, "they haven't even taken off their house-caps." "Hi, you young rascals! We've got 'ee! What be doing to Master Vidley's bullocks?" a man cried. "Oh, we found them," said de Vitre, who bore himself well in defeat. "Would you like 'em?" "Found 'em? They bullocks drove like that, all heaving and pinking and hotted? Oh, 'tis shameful. You nigh to killed the cows, let alone stealing 'em. They sends poor boys to jail for half of this." "That's a lie," said Beetle to McTurk, lying in the wet grass. "I know, but they always say it. Remember when they collared us at the monkey farm that Sunday, with the apples in your topper?" "My aunt, they're going to lock 'em up and send for Vidley," Corcoran whispered, as one of the captors hurried downhill in the direction of Appledore, and the prisoners were led into the barn. "But they haven't taken their names and numbers," said Stalky, who had fallen into the hands of the enemy more than once. "But they're bottled tight, oh. Rather sickly for de Vitre," said Beetle. "It's one licking anyhow, even if Vidley don't hammer him. The head's pretty wild about gate lifting and poaching and that sort of thing. He won't care for cattle stealing much." "It's awfully bad for cows, too, to run 'em about in milk," said McTurk, lifting one knee from a sodden primrose tuft. "What's the next move, Corky?" "Let's get into the old cart shed where we smoked last Tuesday. It's next to the barn. We can cut across while they're inside, and get in through the window." "Suppose we're collared," said Beetle, cramming his red and black house-cap into his pocket. One does not attack under house colours. "That's just it. They'd never dream of any more chaps walking bung into the trap. Besides, we can get through the roof if they spot us. Keep your eye on Uncle. Come on." A swift dash carried them to a huge clump of nettles beneath the unglazed back window of the cart shed. Its open front, of course, gave on to the barnyard. They scrambled through, dropped among the carts, and climbed up to a rudely boarded upper floor that they had discovered a week ago when in search of retirement. It covered half of the building, and ended in darkness at the barn wall. The roof tiles were broken and displaced. Through the chinks they commanded a clear view of the yard, half filled with disconsolate cattle, steaming sadly in the rain. "You see," said Corcoran, ever careful to secure an open line of retreat, "if they bottle us up in here, we'll squeeze out between these rafters, slide down the roof, and bunk. They couldn't even get out through the window. They'd have to run right round the barn. Now are you satisfied, you burbler?" "Huh! You only said that to make quite sure yourself," Beetle retorted. "If the boards weren't loose, I swear I'd kick you," growled Corcoran. "What's the sense of getting into a place if you can't get out of it? Shut up and listen." A confused murmur of voices reached them from the end of the attic. McTurk tiptoed thither with caution. "Hi! It leads through. At least you can get through. Come along." He fingered the boarded wall. "What's the other side?" said Corcoran, cautious. "Hey, you idiot!" They heard his boot heels grating on wood, and he was gone. At some time or other, sheep must have been folded in the cart shed, and an inventive farmhand, sooner than take the hay round, had displaced a board in the barn side and thrust fodder through. It was in no sense a lawful path, but 12 inches square is all that any boy needs. "Look," said Beetle, as they waited McTurk's return. "The beastly cattle are coming in out of the wet." A brown, hairy back showed some 3 feet below the half floor, as one by one the cattle shouldered in for shelter among the carts, filling the shed with their sweet breath. "That blocks our way out, unless we get out by the roof, and that's rather too much of a drop unless we have to," said Corcoran. "They're all bung in front of the window. What a day we're having." "Corcoran! Beetle!" McTurk's whisper shook with delight. "Can you see 'em? I've seen 'em. They're in a blue funk in the barn, and the two clods are making fun of 'em horrid. Orrin's trying to bribe 'em, and Parsons nearly blubbing. Come and look. I'm in the hayloft. Get through the hole. Don't make a row, Beetle." Lithely they wriggled between the displaced boards into the hay, and crawled to the edge of the loft. 3 years of skirmishing against a hard and unsympathetic peasantry had taught them the elements of strategy. For tactics they looked to Corcoran, but even Beetle, notoriously absent-minded, held a lock of hay before his head as they crept forward. There was no haste, no betraying giggle, no squeak of excitement. They had learned by stripes the unwisdom of these things. But the conference, by a root cutter on the barn floor, was deep in its own affairs. De Vitre's party, promising, entreating, and cajoling, while the natives laughed. "Wait till Muster Vidley and Muster Towie, yes, and the policeman come," was the only answer. "'Tis about time to go milking. What'll us do, Abram?" "You go to milk, Tom, and I'll stay along of the young gentleman," said the bigger of the two captors. "Mr. Towie, he's like to charge you for using his yard so free. Is fie. You'll be what proper. Reckon you'll be asking for junkets to set in this week o' Sundays to come. But Mr. Vidley, he'll give 'ee the best lathering of all. He'm passionful, I tell 'ee." Tom stumped out to milk. The barn doors closed behind him, and in the fading light a great gloom fell on all but Abraham, who discoursed eloquently on Mr. Vidley, his temper and attributes. Corcoran turned in the hay and retreated to the attic, followed by his army. "No good," was his verdict. "I'm afraid it's all up with them. We'd better get out." "Yes, but look at these beastly cows," said McTurk, spitting onto a heifer's back. "It'll take us a week to shove 'em away from the window, and that brute Tom'll hear us. He's just across the yard milking." "Do we come then?" said Corcoran. "Hang it, I'm sorry to have to go, though. If we could get that other beast out of the barn for a minute, we might make a rescue. Well, it's no good." He drew forth a long, lean, well-worn home-made catapult, the tweaker of those days, slipped a buckshot into supple chamois leather pouch, and pulled to the full stretch of the elastic. The others followed his example. They only wished to get the kettle out of the way, but seeing the backs so near, they deemed it their duty each to choose his bird and let fly with all their strength. They were not in the least prepared for what followed. 3 bullocks, smitten as they believed by Io's gadfly, trying to wheel amid 6 close-pressed companions, not to mention 3 calves, several carts, and all the lumber of a general utility shed, cannot turn end for end without confusion. It was lucky for the boys that they stood a little back on the floor, because one horned head, tossed in pain, flung up a loose board at the edge, and it came back down lancewise on amazed backs. Another victim floundered bodily across the shafts of a decrepit gig, smashing these and oversetting the wheels. That was more than enough for the nerves of the assembly. With wild bellowings and buttings, they dashed into the barnyard and began a very fine free fight on the midden. The last cow out hooked down an old set of harness, which flipped over one eye and trailed behind her. When a companion trod on it, which happened every few seconds, she naturally fell to her knees, and, being a Burrows cow, with the interests of her calf at heart, attacked the first passer-by. Half awed, but wholly delighted, the boys watched the outburst. It was in full flower before they even dreamed of a second shot. Tom came out of the byre with a pitchfork, to be chased in again by the harness cow. A bullock floundered on the muck-heap, fell, rose, and bedded himself to the belly, helpless, astare, and bellowing. The others took great interest in him. Corcoran, through the roof, scientifically tweaked a frisky heifer on the nose, and it is no exaggeration to say that she danced on her hind legs for half a minute. "Abram, oh, Abram! They'm bewitched! They'm raging! 'Tis the milk fever! They'll be drove mad! Oh, Abram! They'll hawn the bullocks! They'll hawn me! Abram!" "Bide till I lock the door," quoth Abram, faithful to his trust. They heard him padlock the barn door, saw him come out with yet another pitchfork. A bullock lowered his head. Abraham ran to the nearest pig pen, where unearthly squeakings told that he had disturbed the peace of a large family. "Beetle," snapped Corcoran, "go in and get 'em up here, quick. We'll keep the cows happy." A people sitting in darkness and the shadow of a monumental licking, too depressed to be angry with De Vitre, heard a voice from on high saying, "Come up here. Come on, come up. There's a way out." They shinned up the loft stanchions without a word, found a boot heel which they were bidden to take for guide, and squeezed desperately through a hole in darkness, to be hauled out by Corcoran. "You got your caps? Did you give 'em your names and numbers?" said he. "Yes. No. That's all right. Drop down here. Don't stop to jaw. Over the cart, through that window, and bunk. Get out." De Vitre needed no second word. They heard him squeak as he dropped among the nettles, and through the roof chinks they watched 4 slight figures disappear into the rain. Tom and Abraham, from byre and pig pen, exhorted the cattle to keep quiet. "By gum," said Beetle, "that was Stalky. How did you think of it?" "You ass, it was the only thing to do. Anybody could have seen that." "Hadn't we better bunk too?" said McTurk uneasily. "Why, we'll be all right. We haven't done anything, have we? I want to hear what old Vidley will say." "Stop tweaking, Turkey. Let 'em cool off. Golly, how that heifer danced! I swear I didn't know cows could be so lively. We're only just in time." "My hat, here's Vidley and Tooey," said Beetle, as 2 farmers, both with sticks, strode into the yard. "Gloats, oh gloats, fids, oh fids, hefty fids and gloats to us," said Corcoran. These words, in their vocabulary, expressed the extreme of delight. Gloats implies more or less of personal triumph. Fids is felicity in the abstract, and the boys were tasting both that day. Last joy of all, they had the pleasure of Mr. Vidley's acquaintance, albeit he did not love them. Toohey was more of a stranger, his orchards lying over near the public road. Tom and Abraham together told a tale of stolen cattle, maddened by overdriving, of cows sure to die in calving, and of milk that would never return. That made Mr. Vidley swear for 3 consecutive minutes in the soft speech of North Devon. "'Tis too bad, 'tis too bad," said Toohey consolingly. "Let's hope they haven't took no great harm. They be wonderful wild, though." "'Tis all well for you, Toohey, that sells them dumb collegers 70 quarter a week." "80," Toohey replied, with the meek triumph of one who has underbidden his neighbour on tender. "But that's no odds to me. You'm free to lather 'em same as if they was your own sons. On my barn floor shall 'ee lather 'em." "Generous old pig," said Beetle. "De Vitre ought to have stayed for this." "They'm all safe and to rights," said the officious Abraham, producing the key. "Reckon us'll come in and hold 'em for you. Hey! The cows are fair raging still. Us'll have to run for it." The barn being next to the shed, the boys could not see that stately entry, but they heard, "Go on and hide it up in the hay. Aye, they'm proper afraid." "Routin' out," thundered Vidley, rattling a stick impatiently on the root cutter. "Oh, my aunt," said McTurk, standing on one foot. Shut the door. I tell 'ee, reckon us can find un in the dark. Us don't want un boltin' like rabbitses under our elbows." The big barn door closed with a clang. "My hat," said Corcoran, which was always his oath in time of action. He dropped down and was gone for perhaps 10 seconds. "And that's all right," he said, returning at a gentle pace. "What?" McTurk almost shrieked, for Corcoran, in the shed below, waved a large key. "Stalks, Fabulous Stalks, bottled 'em, all 4, was the reply, and Beetle fell on his bosom. "Yes, they'm so's to say like locked up. If you're going to laugh, Beetle, I shall have to kick you." "But I must." Beetle was purple with suppressed mirth. "You won't do it here, then." He thrust the already limp Beetle through the cart-shed window. It sobered him, for one cannot laugh in a bed of nettles. Then Stalky stepped on his prostrate carcass, and McTurk followed, just as Beetle would have risen. So he was upset, and the nettles painted his cheek with the likeness of hideous eruptions. "Thought that'd cure you," said Corcoran, with a sniff. Beetle rubbed his face desperately with dock leaves and said nothing. All desire to laugh had gone from him. They entered the lane. A clamour broke out from the barn, a compound noise of horse-like kicks, shaking door panels, and fivefold yells. "They've found it out," said Corcoran. "How strange!" He sniffed again. "Let 'em," said Beetle. "No one can hear 'em. Come on up to Coll." "What a brute you are, Beetle! You only think of your beastly self. Those cows want milking, poor dears. Hear 'em low," said McTurk. "Go back and milk 'em yourself, then," said Beetle, dancing with pain. "We shall miss Coll over, hanging about like this, and I've 2 black marks this week already." "Then you'll have fatigue drill on Monday, sure pop," said Stalky. "Come to think of it, I've got 2 black marks, so see. This is serious. This is hefty serious." "I told you," said Beetle, with vindictive triumph. "And we want to go out after that ox nest on Monday. We shall be swatting dumbbells, though. All your fault. If we'd bunked with De Vitre at first." Stalky paused between the hedgerows. "Hold on a shake and then burble. Do you know, I believe someone's shut up in that barn. I think we ought to go and see." "Don't be a giddy idiot. Come on back to Coll." But Corcoran took no notice of Beetle. He retraced his steps to the head of the lane, and, lifting his voice, cried, as in bewilderment, "Hello! Who's there? What's that row about? Who are you?" "Oh, Peter," said Beetle, and forgot his pain in this new and jestful development. "Oi! Oi! You let us out!" The answers came muffled and hollow from the black bulk of the barn, with renewed thunders on the door. "Now, play up," said Corcoran. "Turkey, you keep the cows merry. We've just discovered 'em. We don't know anything, remember. Keep your eye on your uncle." They picked their way over the muck and held speech through the crack by the hinge. 3 more genuinely surprised boys the North Devon rain never fell upon. And they were so polite and so difficult to enlighten. They had to be told again and again. "We've been here for hours and hours." That was Toohey. "And the cows to milk and all." That was Vidley. "The door, she blued against us and jammed herself." That was Abraham. Yes, we can see that. It's quite jammed this side," said Stalky. "How careless you farmers are." Openin'. Bash her open with a rock, young gentleman. The cows are milk-heated and raging. Haven't you boys no sense?" Seeing that McTurk from time to time tweaked the wretched cattle into renewed bellowings and caperings, it was quite possible that the boys had some knowledge of a sort. But Mr. Vidley was rude. They told him so through the door, professing only now to recognize his voice. "Humour him if he can. I paid 7 and 6 for the Dom padlock," said Toohey. "Never mind him. 'Tis only old Vidley. Be you going to stay a prisoner and captive for the sake of a lock, Toohey? I'm shamed of 'ee. Rout and open, young gentleman. 'Twas a God's own mercy you were at us. Toohey, you'm a born miser." "It'll be a long job," said Corcoran. "Look here, it's near our call over. If we stay to help you, we'll miss it. We've come miles out of our way already after you." "Tell your master, then, what keeps he? An errand of mercy, like." "I'll tell un, too, when we bring the milk to-morrow," said Toohey. "That's no good," said Corcoran. "We may be caned twice over by then. You'll have to give us a letter." McTurk, backed against the barn wall, was firing steadily and accurately into the cattle. Yes. Come down to my house. My missus'll write ye a beauty, young gentleman. She makes the bills. I'll give ye such a letter of recommendation as I'd give my own son, if only you can humour the Dom lock." "Never mind the lock," Vidley wailed. "Let me get to my poor Dom cows, for they'm dead." They went to work with ostentatious rattlings and wrenchings, and a good deal of the by-play that Corcoran always loved. At last the noise of unlocking was covered by some fancy hammering with a young boulder. The door swung open, and the captives marched out. "Hurry up, Mr. Toohey," said Corcoran. "We ought to be getting back. Will you give us that note, please?" "Some of you collegers was driving my cattle off the Burrowses," said Vidley. "I give ye fair warning. I'll tell your masters." "I know you." He glared at Corcoran. McTurk looked him over from head to heel with a slow stare. "Oh, it's only old Vidley, drunk again, I suppose. Well, we can't help that. Come on, Mr. Toohey. We'll go to your house." "Drunk, am I? I'll drink ye." "How do I know you bain't same lot?" "Abram, did he take their names and numbers?" "What is he raving about?" said Beetle. "My good fool, can't you see that if we'd taken your beastly cattle, we shouldn't be hanging around your beastly barns? 'Pon my Sam, you governors haven't any sense." "Let alone gratitude," said Corcoran. "I suppose he was drunk, Mr. Toohey, and you locked him in the barn to get sober. Shocking, oh, shocking." Vidley denied the charge in language that the boys' mothers would have wept to hear. "Well, go and look after your cows, then," said McTurk. "Don't stand here cursing us because we've been kind enough to help you out of a scrape." Why on earth weren't your cows milked before? You're no farmer. It's long past milking. No wonder they're half crazy. Disreputable old bog-trotter, you are. Brush your hair, sir. Beg your pardon, Mr. Toohey. I hope we're not keeping you. They left Vidley, dancing on the muck-heap amid the cows, and devoted themselves to propitiating Mr. Toohey on their way to his house. Exercise had made them hungry, and hunger is the mother of good manners. They won golden opinions from Mrs. Toohey. "3/4 of an hour late for call over, and 15 minutes late for lock-up," said Foxy the school sergeant crisply. He was waiting for them at the head of the corridor. "Report to your housemaster, please. And a nice mess you're in, young gentleman." "Quite right, Foxibus. Strict attention to duty does it," said Corcoran. "Now, where, if we asked you, would you say that His Honour, Mr. Prout, might, at this moment of time, be found prouting?" "In his study as usual, Mr. Corcoran. He took call over." "Did he? Hurrah! Luck's with us. Don't blub, Foxy. I'm afraid you won't catch us this time." "We went up to change, sir, before coming to you. That made us a little late, sir. We weren't really very late. We were detained by an errand of mercy," said Beetle, and they laid Mrs. Toohey's laboriously written note before him. "We thought you'd prefer a letter, sir. He got himself locked into a barn, and we heard him shouting. Toohey, who brings the coal milk, sir. And we went to let him out." "There were ever so many cows waiting to be milked," said McTurk. "And, of course, he couldn't get at 'em, sir. They said the door had jammed. There's the note, sir." Mr. Prout read it over twice. It was perfectly unimpeachable, only it said nothing but a large T supplied by Mrs. Toohey. "Well, I don't like your getting mixed up with farmers and podpolypers. Of course, you'll not have any more to do with the Tooheys." "Of course not, sir. It was really on account of the cows, sir," said McTurk, glowing with philanthropy. "And you came straight back?" "We ran nearly all the way from the cattle gate," said Corcoran, carefully developing the unessential. "That's a mile, sir. Of course, we had to get the note from Toohey first. But it was because we went to change, we were rather wet, sir, that we were really late. After we'd reported ourselves to the sergeant, sir, and he knew we were in call, we didn't like to come to your study all dirty." "Sweeter than honey in the comb," was the voice of Beetle. "Very good. Don't let it happen again." Their housemaster learned to know them better in later years. They entered, not to say swaggered into, a form room, where De Vitre, Orrin, Parsons, and Howlett, before the fire, were still telling their adventures to admiring associates. They rose as one boy. "What happened to you? We just saved call over. Did you stay on? Tell us." The three smiled pensively. They were not distinguished for telling more than was necessary. "Oh, we stayed on a bit, and then we came away," said McTurk. "That's all." "You scab, you might tell a chap, anyhow." "Think so? Well, that's awfully good of you, De Vitre. 'Pon my sainted Sam, that's awfully good of you," said Corcoran, shouldering into the centre of the warmth and toasting one slippered foot before the blaze. "So you really think we might tell you?" They stared at the coals and shook with deep, delicious chuckles. "My hat, we were stalky," said McTurk. "I swear we were about as stalky as they make 'em, weren't we?" "It was a fabulous stalk," said Beetle. "Much too good to tell you brutes, though." The form wriggled under the insult, but made no motion to avenge it. After all, on De Vitre's showing, the three had saved the raiders from a public licking. "It wasn't half bad," said Corcoran. "Stalky is the word." "You were the really stalky one," said McTurk, one contemptuous shoulder turned to the listening world. "By gum, you were stalky." Corcoran accepted the compliment and the name together. "Yes," said he. Keep your eye on your Uncle Stalky, and he'll pull you through." "Well, you needn't gloat so," said de Vitre viciously. "You look like a stuffed cat." Corcoran, henceforth to be known as Stalky, took not the faintest notice, but smiled dreamily. "My hat. Yes, of course," he murmured. "Your Uncle Stalky. A deuced good name. Your Uncle Stalky is no end of a stalker. He's a great man, I swear he is. De Vitre, you're an ass, a putrid ass." De Vitre would have denied this, but for assenting murmurs from Parsons and Orrin. "You needn't rub it in, then." "But I do. I does. You're such a whopping ass. Do you know it? Think over it a bit at prep. Think it up in bed. Just oblige me by thinking of it every half hour till further notice. Gummy, what an ass you are! But your Uncle Stalky," he picked up the form room poker and drove it thoughtfully against the mantelpiece, "is a great man." "Hear, hear!" said Beetle and McTurk, who had fought under that general. "Isn't your Uncle Stalky a great man, de Vitre? Speak the truth, you fat-headed old impostor." "Yes," said de Vitre, deserted by his band. I suppose he is." "Mustn't suppose. Don't guess." "Well, he is." "A great man?" "A great man." "Now, won't you tell us?" said de Vitre pleadingly. "Not by a heap," said Stalky Corcoran. Therefore the tale has stayed untold until today. Editor's note. This is the first of a series of stories that Mr. Kipling has written about Stalky, Beetle, McTurk, and their associates. The second, entitled An Unsavory Interlude, will appear in the January number. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Regulus by Rudyard Kipling. Regulus, a Roman general, defeated the Carthaginians 256 B.C., but was next year defeated and taken prisoner by the Carthaginians, who sent him to Rome with an embassy to ask for peace, or an exchange of prisoners. Regulus strongly advised the Roman Senate to make no terms with the enemy. He then returned to Carthage and was put to death. The fifth form had been dragged several times in its collective life from one end of the school Horace to the other. Those were the years when army examiners gave thousands of marks for Latin, and it was Mr. King's hated business to defeat them. Hear him, then, on a raw November morning at second lesson. "Aha!" he began, rubbing his hands. "Cras ingens iterabimus aequor. Our portion today is the fifth ode of the third book, I believe, concerning one Regulus, a gentleman. How often have we been through it?" "Twice, sir," said Malpas, the head of the form. Mr. King shuddered. "Yes, twice, quite literally," he said. "Today, with an eye to your army viva voce examinations, I shall exact somewhat freer and more florid renditions, with feeling and comprehension, if that be possible. I accept," here his eye swept the back benches, "our friend and companion Beetle, from whom, now as always, I demand an absolutely literal translation." The form laughed subserviently. "Spare his blushes. Beetle charms us first." Beetle stood up, confident in the possession of a guaranteed construe, left behind by McTurk, who had that day gone to the sick house with a cold. Yet he was too wary a hand to show confidence. "Credidimus, we have believed," he opened in hesitating slow time. "Tonantem Jovan, thundering Jove, regnari, to reign, Caelo, in heaven, Augustus, habebitur, will be held or considered, praesens divus, a present god, adjectis Britannis, the Britons being added imperio to the empire. Gravibusque Persis, with the heavy, stern Persians. What? The grave or stern Persians. Beetle pulled up with the "Thank God I have done my duty, sir" air of Nelson in the cockpit. "I am quite aware," said King, "that the first stanza is about the extent of your knowledge. But continue, sweet one, continue. Gravibus, by the way, is usually translated as troublesome." Beetle drew a long and tortured breath. The second stanza, which carries over to the third of that ode, is what is technically called a stinker. But McTurk had done him handsomely. Millesne Crassi has the soldier of Crassus, vixit lived, turpis maritus, a disgraceful husband. "You slurred the quantity of the word after turpis," said King. "Let's hear it." Beetle guessed again, and for a wonder hit the correct quantity. A disgraceful husband, a conjuge barbara, with a barbarous spouse. "Why did you select that disgustful equivalent out of all the dictionary?" King snapped. "Isn't wife good enough for you?" "Yes, sir. But what do I do about this bracket, sir? Shall I take it now?" "Confine yourself at present to the soldier of Crassus." "Yes, sir." "Et and consenuit, has he grown old, in armis, in the arms, hositum socerorum, of his father-in-law's enemies." "Who, how, which?" "Arms of his enemies' fathers-in-law, sir." "Thanks. By the way, what meaning do you attach to in armis?" "Oh, weapons of war, sir." There was a virginal note in Beetle's voice, as though he had been falsely accused of uttering indecencies. "Shall I take the bracket now, sir?" "Since it seems to be troubling you." "Pro curia. Oh, for the Senate House. Inversique mores, and manners upset, upside down." "Very like your translation. Meantime, the soldier of Crassus, sub rege medo, under a Median king, Marsus et Apulus, being a Martian and an Apulian." "Who, the Median king?" "No, sir, the soldier Crassus. Oblitus agrees with Millesne Crassi, sir," volunteered to hasty Beetle. "Does it? It doesn't with me." "Oh, blightus," Beetle corrected hastily. "Forgetful, ancilliorum of the shields, or trophies, et nominis, and the his name, et togae, and the toga, eternique vestae, and eternal vesta. In columni Jove, Jove being safe, et urbe Roma, and the Roman city," with an air of hardly restrained zeal. "Shall I go on, sir?" Mr. King winced. "No, thank you. You have indeed given us a translation. May I ask if it conveys any meaning whatever to your so-called mind?" "Oh, I think so, sir." This with a gentle toleration for Horace and all his works. "We envy you. Sit down." Beetle sat down, relieved, well knowing that a reef of uncharted genitives stretched ahead of him, on which, in spite of McTurk's sailing directions, he would infallibly have been wrecked. Rattray, who took up the task, steered neatly through them and came unscathed to port. "Here we require drama," said King. "Regulus himself is speaking now. Who shall represent the provident-minded Regulus? Winton, will you kindly oblige?" Winton of King's House, a long, heavy, tow-headed, second 15 forward, overdue for his first 15 colours, and in aspect like an earnest elderly horse, rose up and announced, among other things, that he had seen signs affixed to Punic deluges. Half the form shouted for joy, and the other half for joy that there was something to shout about. Mr. King opened and shut his eyes with great swiftness. "Sigma et fixa delubris?" he gasped. "So delubris is deluges, is it, Winton? In all our dealings, have I ever suspected you of a jest?" "No, sir," said a rigid and angular Winton, while the form rocked about him. "And yet you assert delubris means deluges. Whether I am a fit subject for such a jape is, of course, a matter of opinion. But, Winton, you are normally conscientious. May we assume you looked out delubris?" "No, sir." Winton was privileged to speak that truth dangerous to all who stand before kings. "Made a shot at it, then?" Every line of Winton's body showed that he had done nothing of the sort. Indeed, the very idea that Pater Winton, and a boy is not called Pater by companions for his frivolity, would make a shot at anything was beyond belief. But he replied, "Yes," and all the while worked with his right heel, as though he were heeling a ball at punt-about. Though none dared boast of being a favourite with the king, the taciturn, three-cornered Winton stood high in his housemaster's opinion. It seemed to save him neither rebuke nor punishment, but the two were in some fashion sympathetic. Said King dryly. "I was going to say, flagito additis damnum. But I think I see the process. Beetle, the translation of delubris, please." Beetle raised his head from his shaking arm long enough to answer, "Ruin, sir." There was an impressive pause, while King checked off crimes on his fingers. Then to Beetle the much-enduring man addressed his winged words. "Guessing," said he. "Guessing, Beetle, as usual. From the look of delubris, that it bore some relation to diluvium or deluge, you imparted the result of your half-baked lucubrations to Winton, who seemed to have been lost enough to have accepted it. Observing next your companion's fall, from the presumed security of your undistinguished position in the rearguard, you took another pot-shot. The turbid chaos of your mind threw up some memory of the word dilapidations, which you have pitifully attempted to disguise under the synonym of ruins." As this was precisely what Beetle had done, he looked hurt but forgiving. "We will attend to this later," said King. "Go on, Winton, and retrieve yourself." Delubris happened to be the one word which Winton had not looked out, but had asked Beetle for, when they were settling into their places. He forged ahead with no further trouble. Only when he rendered scilicet as forsooth, King erupted. "Regulus," he said, "was not a leader-writer for the penny press, nor, for that matter, was Horace. Regulus says, 'The soldier ransomed by gold will become keener for the fight.' Will he, by gum? That's the meaning of scilicet. It indicates contempt, bitter contempt. Forsooth, forsooth. You'll be talking about speckled beauties, and eventually transpire next. Howell, what do you make of that doubled vidi ego, ego vidi? It wasn't put in to fill up the meter, you know." "Isn't it intensive, sir?" said Howell, afflicted by a genuine interest in what he read. Regulus was a bit in earnest about Rome making no terms with Carthage, and he wanted to let the Romans understand it, didn't he, sir?" "Less than your usual grace, but the fact. Regulus was in earnest. He was also engaged at the same time in cutting his own throat with every word he uttered. He knew Carthage, which, your examiners won't ask you this, so you needn't take notes, was a sort of God-forsaken nigger Manchester. Regulus was not thinking about his own life. He was telling Rome the truth. He was playing for his side. Those lines from the 18th to the 40th ought to be written in blood. Yet there are things in human garments which will tell you that Horace was a flaneur, a man about town. Avoid such beings. Horace knew a great deal. He knew. Erit ille fortis. Will he be brave, who once to faithless foes has knelt? And again, stop pawing with your hooves, Thornton. Hic unde vitam sumeret inscius. That means roughly, but I perceive I'm ahead of my translators. Begin at hic unde, Vernon, and let us see if you have the spirit of Regulus. Now, no one expected fireworks from gentle Paddy Vernon, sub-prefect of Hartrop's house. But, as must often be the case with growing boys, his mind was in abeyance for the time being, and he said, all in a rush, on behalf of Regulus, O magna Carthago proposis altior Italiae ruinis. O Carthage, thou wilt stand forth higher than the ruins of Italy. Even Beetle, most lenient of critics, was interested at this point, though he did not join the half-groan of reprobation from the wiser heads of the form. Please don't mind me, said King, and Vernon kindly did not. He ploughed on thus. He, Regulus, is related to have removed from himself the kiss of the shameful wife and of his small children, as less by the head, and, being stern, to have placed his virile visage on the ground. Since King loved virile about as much as he did spouse or forsooth, the form looked up hopefully. But Jove thundered not. Until, Vernon continued, he should have confirmed the sliding fathers as being the author of counsel never given under an alias. He stopped, conscious of the stillness around him, like the dead calm of the typhoon's centre. King's opening voice was sweeter than honey. I am painfully aware by bitter experience that I cannot give you any idea of the passion, the power, the essential guts of the lines which you have so foully outraged in our presence. But the note changed. In so far as in me lies, I will strive to bring home to you, Vernon, the fact that there exist in Latin a few pitiful rules of grammar, of syntax, nay, even of declension, which were not created for your incult sport, your Boeotian diversion. You will therefore, Vernon, write out and bring to me tomorrow a word-for-word English-Latin translation of the Ode, together with a full list of all adjectives. An adjective is not a verb, Vernon, as the lower third will tell you. All adjectives, their number, case, and gender. Even now I haven't begun to deal with you faithfully. I am very sorry, sir, Vernon stammered. You mistake the symptoms, Vernon. You are possibly discomforted by the imposition, but sorrow postulates some sort of mind, intellect, nous. Your rendering of proboscis alone stamps you lower than the beasts of the field. Will someone take the taste out of our mouths? And, talking of tastes, he coughed. There was a distinct flavour of chlorine gas in the air. Up went an eyebrow, though King knew perfectly well what it meant. Mr. Hartrop's science class next door, said Malpas. Oh, yes, I had forgotten. Our newly established modern side, of course. Perrone, open the windows, and Winton, go on once more from Interque Mairentes. And hastened away, said Winton, surrounded by his morning friends, into illustrious banishment. But I got that out of Connington, sir, he added in one conscientious breath. I am aware. The master generally knows his ass's crib, though I acquit you of any intention that way. Can you suggest anything for egregious exul, only egregious exile? I fear egregious is a good word ruined. No? You can't in this case improve on Conington. Now then, for atqui scebat quae sibi barbarus tortor pararet. The whole force of this lies in the atqui. Although he knew, Winton suggested. Stronger than that, I think. He who knew well, Malpass interpolated. Yes, well though he knew. I don't like Conington's well-witting. It's Wardour Street. Well though he knew what the savage torturer was getting ready for him, said Winton. Yes, had in store for him. Yet he brushed aside his kinsman and the people delaying his return. Yes, but how do you render obstantes? If it's a free translation, mightn't obstantes and mortantem come to about the same thing, sir? Nothing comes to about the same thing with Horace, Winton. As I have said, Horace was not a journalist. Now, I take it that his kinsman bodily withstood his departure, whereas the crowd, populumque, the democracy, stood about futilely pitying him and getting in the way. Now, for that noblest of endings, quam si clientum. And King ran off into the quotation, as though some tedious business o'er, of client's court his journey lay, towards Venafrum's grassy floor, or Sparta-built Tarentum's bay. All right, Winton, Beetle, when you've quite finished dodging the fresh air yonder, give me the meaning of tendens, and turn down your collar. Me, sir? Tendens, sir? Oh, stretching away in the direction of, sir. Idiot! Regulus was not a feature of the landscape. He was a man, self-doomed to death by torture. Atqui scebat, knowing it, having achieved it for his country's sake. Can't you hear that atqui cut like a knife? He moved off with some dignity. That's why Horace, out of the whole golden Latin tongue, chose the one word, tendens, which is utterly untranslatable. The gross injustice of being asked to translate it converted Beetle into a young Christian martyr, till King buried his nose in his handkerchief again. I think they've broken another gas bottle next door, sir, said Howell. They're always doing it. The form coughed as more chlorine came in. Well, I suppose you must be patient with the modern side, said King. But it's most insupportable for this side. Vernon, what are you grinning at? Vernon's mind had returned to him glowing and inspired. He chuckled as he underlined his Horace. It appears to amuse you, said King. Let us participate. What is it? The last 2 lines of the 10th ode in this book, sir, was Vernon's amazing reply. What? Oh, I see. Non hoc semper erit liminis aut aeque Caelestis patens latus. King's mouth twitched to hide a grin. Was that done with intention? This side will not always be patient of rain and waiting on the household. I thought it fitted, sir. It does. It's distinctly happy. What put it into your thick head, Paddy? I don't know, sir, except we did the ode last term. And you remembered. The same head that minted proposis as a verb. Vernon, you are an enigma. No, this side will not always be patient of unheavenly gases and waters. I will make representations to our so-called moderns. Meantime, who shall say that I am not just? I remit you your accrued pains and penalties in regard to probosium, proposis, proposit, and other enormities. I oughtn't to do it, but this side is occasionally human. By no means bad, Paddy. Thank you, sir, said Vernon, wondering how inspiration had visited him. Then King, with a few brisk remarks about science, headed them back to Regulus. of whom, and of Horace and Rome, and evil-minded commercial Carthage, and of the democracy, eternally futile, he explained, in all ages and climes, he spoke for 10 minutes, passing thence to the next ode, Delicta Majorum, where he fetched up, full-voiced, upon Diste minorem quod geris imperas. Thou rulest because thou bearest thyself as lower than the gods, making it a text for a discourse on manners, morals, and respect for authority, as distinct from bottled gases, which lasted till the bell rang. Then Beetle, concertinaing his books, observed to Winton, "When King's really on tap, he's an interesting dog. Hartop's chlorine uncorked him." "Yes, but why did you tell me Delubris was deluges, you silly ass?" said Winton. "Well, that uncorked him too. Look out, you hoof-handled old owl." Winton had cleared for action as the form poured out like puppies at play, and was scragging Beetle. Stalky, from behind, followed Winton low. The three fell in confusion. Diste minorem quod geris imperas, quoth Stalky, ruffling Winton's lint-white locks. "Mustn't jape the number 5 study. Don't be too virtuous. Don't brood over it. 'Twon't count against you in your future career. Cheer up, Pater. Pile him off my essential guts, will you?" said Beetle from underneath. "He's squashing them." They dispersed to their studies. No one, the owner least of all, can explain what is in a growing boy's mind. It might have been the blind ferment of adolescence. Stalky's random remarks about virtue might have stirred him. Like his betters, he might have sought popularity by way of clowning, or, as the head asserted years later, the only known jest of his serious life might have worked on him as a sober-sided man's one love colours and dislocates all his after days. But at the next lesson, mechanical drawing with Mr. Lidgett, who, as drawing master, had very limited powers of punishment, Winton fell suddenly from grace, and let loose a live mouse in the form-room. The whole form, shrieking and leaping high, threw at it all the plaster cones, pyramids, and fruit in high relief, not to mention ink-pots that they could lay hands on. Mr. Lidgett reported at once to the head. Winton owned up to his crime, which, venial in the upper third, pardonable at a price in the lower fourth, was, of course, rank ruffianism on the part of a fifth-form boy, and so, by graduated stages, he arrived at the head's study just before lunch, penitent, perturbed, annoyed with himself, and, as the head said to King in the corridor after the meal, more human than he had known him in 7 years. "You see," the head drawled on, "Winton's only fault is a certain costive and unaccommodating virtue. So this comes very happily." "I never noticed any sign of it," said King. Winton was in King's house, and though King, as proconsul, might and did infernally impress his own province, once a black and yellow cap was in trouble at the hands of the imperial authority, King fought for him to the very last steps of Caesar's throne. "Well, you yourself admitted just now that the mouse was beneath the occasion," the head answered. "It was," said King. Mr. King did not love Mr. Lidgett. "It should have been a rat. But I hate to plead it. It's the lad's first offence." "Could you have damned him more completely, King?" What's the penalty?" said King in retreat, but keeping up a rearguard action. "Only my usual few lines of Virgil be shown up by tea-time." The head's eyes turned slightly to that end of the corridor where Mullins, captain of the games, old Pot, or Potiphar Mullins, was pinning up the usual Wednesday notice. "Big, middle, and little side football, A to K, L to Z, 3 to 4:45 p.m." You cannot write out the head's usual few, which means 500, Latin lines, and play football for more than 1 3/4. for more than 1 hour and 3/4 between the hours of 1:30 and 5 p.m. Winton had evidently no intention of trying to do so, for he hung about the corridor with a set face and an uneasy foot. Yet it was law in the school, compared to which that of the Medes and Persians was no more than non-committal resolution. That any boy outside the first 15 who missed his football for any reason whatever, and had not a written excuse duly signed by competent authority to explain his absence, would receive not less than 3 strokes with a ground ash from the captain of the games. Generally a youth between 17 and 18 years, rarely under 7 stone. Pot was nearer 13, and always in hard condition. King knew without inquiry that the head had given Winton no such excuse. "But he's practically a member of the first 15. He's played for it all this term," said King. "I believe his cap should have arrived next week." "His cap has not been given him. Oddly, therefore, he is naught. I rely on old Pot." "But Mullins is Winton's study mate," King persisted. Pot Mullins and Pater Winton were cousins and rather close friends. "That will make no difference to Mullins or Winton if I know 'em," said the head. But King played his last card desperately. "I was going to recommend Winton for extra sub-prefect in my house, now Carton has gone." "Certainly," said the head. "Why not? He will be excellent by tea time, I hope." At that moment he saw Mr. Lidgett tripping down the corridor, waylaid by Winton. "It's about that mouse business at mechanical drawing," Winton opened, swinging across his path. Yes, highly disgraceful," Mr. Lidgett panted. "I know it was," said Winton. It was a cad's trick, because you knew I couldn't give you more than 50 lines," said Mr. Lidgett. "Well, anyhow, I've come to apologize for it." "Certainly," said Mr. Lidgett, and added, for he was a kindly man, "I think that shows quite right feeling. I'll tell the head at once. I'm satisfied." No. The boy's still unmended voice jumped from the growl to the squeak. "I didn't mean that. I did it on principle. Please don't do anything of that kind." Mr. Lidgett looked him up and down, and, being an artist, understood. "Thank you, Winton," he said. "This shall be between ourselves." "You heard?" said King, in decent pride in his voice. "Of course. You thought he was going to get Lidgett to beg him off the impot." King denied this with so much warmth that the head laughed, and King went away in a huff. "By the way," said the head, "I've told Winton to do his lines in your form room, not his study." "Thanks," said King over his shoulder, for the head's orders had saved Winton and Mullins, who was doing extra army work in the study, from an embarrassing afternoon together. An hour later King wandered into his form room as though by accident. Winton was hard at work. "Aha!" said King, rubbing his hands. "This does not look like games, Winton. Don't let me arrest your facile pen. Whence this sudden love for Virgil?" "Impo from the head, sir, for that mouse business this morning." "Rumours thereof have reached us." "That was a lapse on your part into lower thirdery which I don't quite understand." The tump-tump of the puntabouts, before the sides settled to games, came through the open window. Winton, like his housemaster, loved fresh air. When they heard Paddy Vernon, sub-prefect on duty, calling the roll in the field and marking defaulters, Winton wrote steadily. King curled himself up on a desk, hands round knees. One would have said that the man was gloating over the boy's misfortune, but the boy understood. "Diste minorem quod geris imperas," quoted King presently. "It is necessary to bear oneself as lower than the local gods, even than drawing masters who are precluded from effective retaliation. I do wish you'd tried that mouse game with me, Pater." Winton grinned, then sobered. "It was a cad's trick, sir, to play on Mr. Lidgett." He peered forward at the page he was copying. Well, the sin I impute to each frustrate ghost. King stopped himself. Why do you goggle like an owl? Hand me the Mantuan and I'll dictate. No matter. Any rich Virgilian measures will serve. I may, peradventure, recall a few. He began. Te regere imperio populos Romane memento. Hae tibi erunt artes pacisque imponerum morem. Parcere subjectis et debellare superbos. There you have it all, Winton. Write that out twice, and yet once again. For the next 40 minutes, with never a glance at the book, King paid out the glorious hexameters, and King could read Latin as though it were alive, Winton hauling them in and coiling them away behind him, as trimmers in a telegraph ship's hold coil away deep-sea cable. King broke from the Aeneid for the Georgics and back again, pausing now and then to translate some specially loved line or to dwell on the treble-shot texture of the ancient fabric. He did not allude to the coming interview with Mullins, except at the last, when he said, I think at this juncture, Pater, I need not ask you for the precise significance of at quis quiebat quae sibi barbarus tortor. The ungrateful Winton flushed angrily, and King loafed out to take 5 o'clock call-over, after which he invited little Hartop to tea and a talk on chlorine gas. Hartop accepted the challenge like a bantam, and the two went up to King's study about the same time as Winton returned to the form-room beneath it to finish his lines. Then half a dozen of the second 15, who should have been washing, strolled in to condole with Pater Winton, whose misfortune and its consequences were common talk. No one was more sincere than the long, red-headed, knotty-knuckled Paddy Vernon, but, being a careless animal, he joggled Winton's desk. "Curse you for a silly ass," said Winton. "Don't do that." No one is expected to be polite while under punishment, so Vernon, sinking his sub-prefectship, replied peacefully enough. "Well, don't be wrathy, Pater." "I'm not," said Winton. "Get out. This ain't your house, form-room." "Form-room don't belong to you. Why don't you go to your own study?" Vernon replied. "Because Mullins is there waiting for the victim," said Stalky delicately, and they all laughed. "You ought to have shaken that mouse out of your trouser leg, Pater. That's the way I did in my youth. Pater's reverting to his second childhood. Never mind, Pater, we all respect you and your future career." Winton, still writhing, growled. Vernon, leaning on the desk, somehow shook it again. Then he laughed. "What are you grinning at?" Winton asked. "I was only thinking of you being sent up to take a licking from Pot. I swear I don't think it's fair. You've never shirked a game in your life, and you're as good as in the first 15 already. Your cap ought to have been delivered last week, oughtn't it?" It was law in the school that no man could by any means enjoy the privileges and immunities of the first 15 till the black velvet cap with the gold tassel, made by dilatory Exeter outfitters, had been actually set on his head. Ages ago, a large-built and unruly second 15 had attempted to change this law, but the prefects of that age were still larger, and the lively experiment had never been repeated. "Will you," said Winton very slowly, "kindly mind your own damned business, you cursed, clumsy, fat-headed fool?" The form-room was as silent as the empty field in the darkness outside. Vernon shifted his feet uneasily. "Well, I shouldn't like to take a licking from Pot," he said. "Wouldn't you?" Winton asked, as he paged the sheets of lines with hands that shook. "No, I shouldn't," said Vernon, his freckles growing more distinct on the bridge of his white nose. "Well, I'm going to take it." Winton moved clear of the desk as he spoke. "But you're going to take a licking from me first." and before anyone realized it, he had flung himself neighing against Vernon. No decencies were observed on either side, and the rest looked on amazed. The two met confusedly, Vernon trying to do what he could with his longer reach, Winton, insensible to blows, only concerned to drive his enemy into a corner and batter him to pulp. This he managed over against the fireplace, where Vernon dropped half-stunned. "Now I'm going to give you your licking," said Winton. "Lie there till I get a ground ash, and I'll cut you to pieces. If you move, I'll chuck you out of the window." He wound his hands into the boy's collar and waistband, and had actually heaved him half off the ground before the others with one accord dropped on his head, shoulders, and legs. He fought them crazily in an awful hissing silence. Stalky's sensitive nose was rubbed along the floor, Beetle received a jolt in the wind that sent him whistling and crowing against the wall, Perowne's forehead was cut, and Malpas's came out with an eye that explained itself, like a dying rainbow, through a whole week. "Mad, quite mad," said Stalky, and for the third time wriggled back to Winton's throat. The door opened, and King came in, Hartopp's little figure just behind him. The mound on the floor panted and heaved, but did not rise, for Winton still squirmed vengefully. "Only a little play, sir," said Perowne. "Only hit my head against a form." This was quite true. "Oh," said King. "Demovit obstantes propinquos. You, I presume, are the populace delaying Winton's return to Mullins, eh?" "No, sir," said Stalky behind his claret-coloured handkerchief. "We're the Majorentes Amicos." "Not bad. You see, some of it sticks after all," King chuckled to Hartopp, and the two masters left without further inquiries. The boys sat still on the now passive Winton. "Well," said Stalky at last, "of all the putrid he-asses, Pater, you are the—" "I'm sorry. I'm awfully sorry," Winton began, and they let him rise. He held out his hand to the bruised and bewildered Vernon. "Sorry, Paddy. I must have lost my temper. I dunno what's the matter with me." "Fat lot of good that'll do my face at tea," Vernon grunted. "Why couldn't you say there was something wrong with you instead of lambing out like a lunatic? Is my lip puffy?" "Just a trifle. Look at my beak." "Well, we got all those pretty marks at footer owing to the zeal with which we played the game," said Stalky, dusting himself. "But do you think you're fit to be let loose again, Pater? Sure you don't want to kill another sub-prefect?" "I wish I was Pot. I'd cut your sprightly young soul out." "I suppose I ought to go to Pot now," said Winton. "And let all the other asses see you looking like this? Not much. We'll all come up to number 5 study and wash off in hot water. Beetle, you aren't damaged. Go along and light the gas stove." "There's a tin of cocoa in my study somewhere," Perowne shouted after him. "Rotal round till you find it and take it up." Separately, by different roads, Vernon's jersey pulled half over his head, the boys repaired to number 5 study. Little Hartopp and King, I'm sorry to say, leaned over the banisters of King's Landing and watched. "Very human," said little Hartopp. "Your virtuous Winton, having got himself into trouble, takes it out of my poor old Paddy. I wonder what precise lie Paddy will tell about his face." "But surely you aren't going to embarrass him by asking," said King. "Your boy won," said Hartopp. "To go back to what we were discussing," said King quickly, "do you pretend that your modern system of inculcating unrelated facts about chlorine, for instance, all of which have been proved fallacies by the time the boys grow up, can have any real bearing on education, even the low type of it that the examiners expect?" "I maintain nothing. But is it any worse than your Chinese reiteration of uncomprehended syllables in a dead tongue?" "Dead, forsooth!" King fairly danced. "The only living tongue on earth. Chinese! My word, Hartopp!" "And the end of 7 years, how often have I said it?" Hartop went on. 7 years of 220 days of 6 hours each. Your victims go away with nothing, absolutely nothing, except, perhaps, if they've been very attentive, a dozen, no, I'll grant you 20, 1 score of totally unrelated Latin tags, which any child of 12 could have absorbed in 2 terms. But, can't you realize that if our system brings later, at any rate, at a pinch, a simple understanding, grammar and Latinity apart, a mere glimpse of the significance, foul word, of, we'll say, 1 ode of Horace, 120 lines of Virgil, we've got what we poor devils of ushers are striving after?" "And what might that be?" said Hartop. "Balance, proportion, perspective, life. Your scientific man is the unrelated animal, the beast without background. Have you ever realized that in your atmosphere of stinks? Meanwhile, you should make them lose life for the sake of living, eh? Blind again, Hartop. I told you about Paddy's quotation this morning. He made proboscis a verb. He did. You yourself heard young Cochrane's reference to Myrentes amicos. It sticks, a little of it sticks among the barbarians." "Absolutely and essentially Chinese," said little Hartop, who, alone in the common room, refused to be outfaced by King. "But I don't understand how Paddy came to be licked by Winton. Paddy's supposed to be something of a boxer." "Beware of vinegar made from honey," King replied. "Pater, like some other people, is patient and long-suffering, but he has his limits. The head is oppressing him damnably, too. As I pointed out, the boy has practically been in the first 15 since term began." "But, my dear fellow, I've known you give a boy an impo and refuse him leave off games again and again." "Ah, but that was when there was real need to get at some oaf who couldn't be sensitized any other way. Now, in our esteemed head's action, I see nothing but—" The conversation from this point does not concern us. Meanwhile, Winton, very penitent and especially polite towards Vernon, was being cheered with cocoa in number 5 study. They had some difficulty in stemming the flood of his apologies. He himself pointed out to Vernon that he had attacked a sub-prefect for no reason whatever, and therefore deserved official punishment. "I can't think what was the matter with me today," he mourned. "Ever since that blasted mouse business." "Well, then, don't think," said Stalky. "Or do you want Paddy to make a row about it before all the school?" Here Vernon was understood to say that he could see Winton and all the school somewhere else. "And if you imagine Perowne and Malpas and me are going to give evidence at a prefects' meeting, just to soothe your beastly conscience, you jolly well are," said Beetle. "I know what you did." "What?" croaked Peter, out of the valley of his humiliation. "You went berserk. I've read all about it in Hypatia." "What's going berserk?" Winton asked. "Never you mind," was the reply. "Now, don't you feel awfully weak and seedy?" "I am rather tired," said Winton, sighing. "That's what you ought to be. You've gone berserk, and pretty soon you'll go to sleep. But you'll probably be liable to fits of it all your life," Beetle concluded. "Shouldn't wonder if you murdered someone some day." "Shut up, you and your berserks," said Stalky. "Go to Mullins now and get it over, Pater." "Call it filthy unjust of the head," said Vernon. "Anyhow, you've given me my licking, old man. I hope Pot'll give you yours." "I'm awfully, awfully sorry," was Winton's last word. It was the custom in that consulship to deal with games defaulters between 5 o'clock call-over and tea. Mullins, who was old enough to pity, did not believe in letting boys wait through the night till the chill of the next morning for their punishments. He was finishing off the last of the small fry and their excuses when Winton arrived. "But please, Mullins," this was Babcock Tertius, a dear little 12-year-old mother's darling, "I had an awful hack on the knee. I've been to Matron about it, and she gave me some iodine. I've been rubbing it in all day. I thought that would be an excuse off." Let's have a look at it, said the impassive Mullins. That's a shin bruise about a week old. Touch your toes, I'll give you the iodine. Babcock yelled loudly, as he had many times before. The face of Jevons, aged 11, a new boy that dark wet term, low in the house, low in the lower school, and lowest of all in his homesick little mind, turned white at the horror of the sight. They could hear his working lips part stickily as Babcock wailed his way out of the hearing. "Hello, Jevons, what brings you here?" said Mullins.
Please, sir, I went for a walk with Babcock Tertius."
"Did you? Then I bet you went to the tuck shop, and you paid, didn't you?" A nod. Jevons was too terrified to speak. "Of course. And I bet Babcock told you that old Pot had let you off because it was the first time." Another nod, with the ghost of a smile in it. "All right." Mullins picked Jevons up before he could guess what was coming, laid him on the table with one hand, with the other gave him 3 emphatic spanks, then held him high in the air. "Now, you tell Babcock Tertius that he's got you a licking from me, and see you jolly well pay it back to him. When you're prefect of games, don't you let anyone shirk his footer without a written excuse. Where do you play your game?" "Forward, sir." "You can do better than that. I've seen you run like a young buck-rabbit. Ask Dixon from me to try you out as 3/4 next game, will you? Cut along." Jevons left, warm for the first time that day, enormously set up in his own esteem, and very hot against the deceitful Babcock. Mullins turned to Winton. "Your name's on the list, Pater." Winton nodded. "I know it. The head landed me with an impo for that mouse business at mechanical drawing. No excuse." "He meant it, then?" Mullins jerked his head delicately towards the ground ash on the table. "I heard something about it." Winton nodded. "Rotten thing to do," he said. "I can't think what I was doing ever to do it. It counts against a fellow so. And there's some more, too." "All right, Pater. Just stand clear of our photo bracket, will you?" The little formality over, there was a pause. Winton swung round, yawned in Pot's astonished face, and staggered towards the window-seat. "What's the matter with you, Dick? Ill?" "No, perfectly all right, thanks. Only a little sleepy." Winton stretched himself out, and then and there fell deeply and placidly asleep. "It isn't a faint," said the experienced Mullins, "or his pulse wouldn't act. It isn't a fit, or he'd snort and twitch. It can't be sunstroke this term, and he hasn't been over-training for anything." He opened Winton's collar, packed a cushion under his head, threw a rug over him, and sat down to listen to the regular breathing. Before long, Stalky arrived, on pretence of borrowing a book. He looked at the window-seat. "Notice anything wrong with Winton lately?" said Mullins. "Notice anything wrong with my beak?" Stalky replied. "Pater went berserk after call-over, and fell on a lot of us for jesting with him about his impo. You ought to see Malpaz's eye." "You mean Pater fought?" said Mullins. "Like a devil. And then he nearly went to sleep in our study just now. I expect he'll be all right when he wakes up. Rummy business. Conscientious old bargee. You ought to have heard his apologies." "But Pater can't fight one little bit," Mullins repeated. "'Twasn't fighting. He just tried to murder everyone." Stalky described the affair, and when he had left, Mullins went off to take counsel with the head, who, out of a cloud of blue smoke, told him that all would yet be well. "Winton," said he, "is a little stiff in his moral joints. He'll get over that. If he asks you whether today's doings will count against him in his—" "But you know it's important to him, sir. His people aren't very well off," said Mullins. "That's why I'm taking all this trouble. You must reassure him, Pot. I have overcrowded him with new experiences. Oh, by the way, has his cap come?" "It came at dinner, sir." Mullins laughed. Sure enough, when he waked at tea-time,
Winton proposed to take Mullins all through every one of his day's lapses from grace. "And do you think it will count against me?" said he.
"Don't you fuss so much about yourself and your silly career," said Mullins. "You're all right. And, here's your first cap at last. Show it up on the bracket and come on to tea." They met King on their way, stepping statelily and rubbing his hands.
"I have applied,"
said he,
"for the services of an additional sub-prefect in Carton's unlamented absence. Your name, Winton, seems to have found favour with the powers that be, and, all things considered, I am disposed to give my support to the nomination. You are therefore a quasi-lictor."
"Then it didn't count against me," Winton gasped as soon as they were out of hearing. A captain of games can jest with a sub-prefect publicly.
"You utter ass,"
said Mullins, and caught him on the back of his stiff neck and ran him down to the hall, where the sub-prefects, who sit below the salt, made him welcome with the economical bloater paste of mid-term. King and little Hartopp were sparring in the Reverend John Gillett's study at 10 p.m. Classical versus modern, as usual.
"Character, proportion, background," snarled King. "That is the essence of the humanities."
"Analects of Confucius," little Hartopp answered.
"Time,"
said the Reverend John behind the soda water.
"You men oppress me.
Hartopp, what did you say to Paddy in your dormitories to-night? Even you couldn't have overlooked his face." "But I did," said Hartopp calmly. "I wasn't even humorous about it, as some clerics might have been. I went straight through and said naught."
"Poor Paddy. Now, for my part," said King, "you know I'm not lavish in my praises. I consider Winton a first-class type. Absolutely first-class."
"Hardly," said the Reverend John. "First class of the second class, I admit. The very best type of second class. But—" he shook his head. "Should have been a rat. Peter'll never be anything more than a colonel of engineers."
"What do you base that verdict on?" said King stiffly.
"It came to me after prayers, with all his conscience." "Poor old Pater. Was it the mouse?" said little Hartopp. "That, and what he called his uncontrollable temper, and his responsibilities as sub-prefect." "And you?" "If we had had what is vulgarly called a pie-jaw, he'd have had hysterics. So I recommended a dose of Epsom salts. He'll take it, too, conscientiously. Don't eat me, King. Perhaps he'll be a K.C.B." 10 o'clock struck, and the army class boys in the further studies, coming to their houses after an extra hour's work, passed along the gravel path below. Someone was chanting to the tune of White Sand and Grey Sand, Dis te minorem quod geris imperas. He stopped outside Mullins's study. They heard Mullins's window slide up, and then Stalky's voice.
"Good evening, Mullins, my barbarous tortor. We're the Waits. We have come to inquire after the local berserk. Is he doing as well as can be expected in his new career?"
"Better than you will in a sec, Stalky," Mullins grunted.
"Glad of that. We thought he'd like to know that Paddy has been carried to the sick house in raving delirium. They think it's concussion of the brain."
"Why, he was all right at prayers," Winton began earnestly, and they heard a laugh in the background as Mullins slammed down the window.
"Night, Regulus,"
Stalky sang out, and the light footsteps went on.
"You see, it sticks. A little of it sticks among the barbarians," said King.
"Amen," said the Reverend John. "Go to bed." A translation. Horace, Book 5, Ode 3. There are those whose study is of smells, and two attentive schools rehearse how something mixed with something else makes something worse. Some cultivate in broths impure the clients of our body. These increasingly without Venus cure or cause disease. Others the heated wheel extol, and all its offspring whose concern is how to make it farthest roll and fastest turn. Me,
much incurious if the hour present or to be paid for brings me to Brundusium by the power of wheels or wings. Me, in whose breasts no flame hath burned, lifelong, save that by Pindar lit. Such lore leaves cold. I am not turned aside to it, more than when, sunk in thought profound, of what the unaltering gods require, my steward, friend but slave, brings